Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wandering DMs. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan. On this episode of Wandering DMs, we're going to talk about stat generation in D&D. I mean, maybe that's the most important thing that you deal with when you start a new Dungeons & Dragons campaign or character. So today we're going to be talking about different methods for stat generation, different measures that they result, and the critical question to roll or not to roll your abilities. All that and more today on Wandering DMs. Paul, you seem to be wandering. I think we've had a number of episodes recently where we're wandering. So we had a little bit of a technical glitch. I hope people are finding the live show today. And Paul is doing a heroic effort getting the show running from where the hell are you, Paul?
I'm up on a lake in northern New Hampshire right now. I would love for you all to see this gorgeous lake to my side here, but of course the lighting is such that it's just all you get is the sun. And then a bright white square. But trust me, gorgeous lake outside right there.
The sun? What kind of crazy person are you, Paul?
And like all good gamers on a gorgeous sunny day out in nature, we are inside talking about games.
As the summer should be, Paul, I think. But let's get into it. So stat generation, I mean, I got in, I was like, oh, what a great topic. And I'm like, oh no, this is like my whole life has been spent analyzing this. And I'm sure that our viewers have, I'm sure, an encyclopedic knowledge of some of the issues. So let's do this in backwards order, because that actually might be a more interesting way to do this. So let's start with the most recent edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Let's start with 6th edition, Paul. Does that make
6th? We can, sure.
Yeah.
That's
right.
Well, do they even call it 6? Is that really what it's called, Dan?
Well, not yet. So some of you may know the news that just came out just 1 or 2 days ago, actually, is Wizards of the Coast announced that they are running their playtest for the next edition of D&D. And you can get playtest materials on D&D Beyond. And no, they're cagily not calling it 6th edition yet. They're calling it, confusingly, they're calling it D&D 1, which is going to be all kinds of trouble for those of us that might actually still play 1st edition D&D.
Isn't it even more weirdly backwards, and it's like 1 D&D or something like that?
Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think it's something really weird like that.
Yeah,
but I mean,
right.
To be fair, 5th edition was called Next, right? Like that's. I was just having this conversation with some folks last night of how, like, I was talking about 6th edition. They're like, "Oh, is 6th edition coming out?" I said, "Well, they're not calling it 6 yet, but that's what we're all going to call it."
It seems like I dug up some of the marketing materials the other day. Actually, I'm probably going to throw that in my blog tomorrow morning. And it seems like what they're saying so far, and of course they want to promote it the best way they can, seems very, very similar to what they said about 5th edition exactly 10 years ago. We're not going to call it 5th edition, and we want it to unify all the editions, and we want everybody to be all playing the game, and we want to be very modular. And if there are 15 competing standards, this is the standard that's going to unify all of them.
Yep. Yeah. Okay.
So and those are all good motivations. I get it. But yes, they claim that they're not calling it 6th edition, but we know what's going to happen based on prior history. So anyway, so if you look at the current document that they've released is just on character generation, and at least what that document says is it says basically we're going to be using the 5th edition rules for almost everything except for these pieces that we're adding or changing. And there's absolutely no talk about stat generation in it. So apparently the stat generation at this moment in 6th edition is exactly 100% what it is in 5th edition.
Okay. Well, that makes it easy to talk about, right? Let's talk about 5th edition.
Yeah, let's talk about 5th edition, Paul.
Great.
So there's the slice of text out of the official 5th edition player's handbook, and technically, if you read that, there's 3. And I think most people that play 5th edition or basically recent editions are probably familiar with this. The number one thing out of the gate for 5th edition is you can roll. You can take 4d6. You can roll the 4d6, drop the low one, take the results, and put them in any order that you want for your abilities. And then it says in the same paragraph, it says, if you don't like this, you can use this standard array of 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 8, which basically have the same average, actually. as the 4d6 drop low. And apparently that first paragraph, the players are automatically given the choice of those two different methods. And then further down the page, there's this thing marked variant, that at the dungeon master's option, you can use this point buy method and take 27 points and pay for your abilities on this table at the bottom there. And I think, what do you think gets most used actually out of those three different things, Paul?
I would expect it's the standard dice rolling 46 drop the lowest.
Really? Okay. All right. That might possibly surprise me, actually.
It's the first one listed, right? I mean,
yeah.
The most common one first is my assumption, and that's my assumption is based solely on like anecdotal what I hear from other people what they're doing. I mean, the thing is, gamers like to roll dice, right? So like any of these systems that take away the dice rolling, like you lose a little bit of that gambling nature, which is, I understand why some people are like, no, we want it more standardized. Don't want to have a party where one person is a god and another person is, feeble. But I don't know. We like our dice.
I'm going to put
that's what I got
David's.
To say about that.
So our viewer David Heron is saying, I bet that the array is most used, and I think
standard array.
Yeah, I feel like the and Joshua is saying the same thing. Joshua is saying my experience is the standard array is most common.
Really?
And just
I'm surprised
my
by
impression.
that.
Yeah, my impression from the online discourse is the same. Actually, is I do think kind of like what you just said. People are sufficiently bothered by variation between the PCs that I if we took a survey, I would bet that probably more people are using standard array than rolling dice these days.
That is really interesting.
Yeah. I'm actually surprised that you guess the opposite.
I always thought the standard array was a speed thing, like you're just generating lots of characters and just you want to go faster. You don't want to be bogged down with rolling dice or doing point buys. So here's just use these numbers. So like I could see DMs using them when they're like prepping a game for a convention, say, right? Like I would probably use it in that case. I just don't want to roll a bunch of dice. I just want to boom, standard array done. Now I'm wondering. I wonder if the standard array has become more popular in the digital age, right? As more people are playing on Roll20 or using D&D Beyond, maybe, the physical dice are less of a thing. And standard array is fast. I got to give it that. Like, it is fast.
Yep. Those are all clearly advantages. And William in the chat is also saying he uses the standard array. Particularly if we're in a zone where, maybe as characters a little bit more complicated to make, you make them in advance, right? Off the table. You won't have the DM there to actually witness the rolls. So assuming that you're offloading that stuff to D&D Beyond and you're making characters maybe from multiple campaigns, or at least before the game, the standard array gives, something that's easy to audit. As opposed to rolling dice offline and just trusting the players, because I certainly in my day I've had players that would cheat my pants off any which way they could with that. So
I would worry
I can see a lot of that.
My fear with the standard array is that it just adds a certain homogeny to things that like you're never gonna see a character with higher than a 15. It's the best score you're ever gonna see is a 15.
Racial modifiers come in after that, and maybe add one or two or something like that. But you're right. You can't just start off with an 18 with that.
Also, it's worth pointing out, of course, that in 5th edition you have the mechanic that didn't exist in earlier editions of stat increase as you level up. Right, that is basically a standard thing. As you're leveling up, you're getting bonuses to stats. And I feel like I wonder if that kind of changes the view of stats and their importance and how much they vary from character to character. That you're kind of doing point buy later, right?
That's an interesting point. I think that's a major point, actually. In fact, I was prepping for this, and then just like minutes before the show, I went, "Oh man, we got to talk about how the abilities go up over time." which again in old school wasn't a thing. I think that started in third. Am I right? I think third edition came in with the stat increases. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Was it maybe an either or choice in third, where like you were either using feats or stat increase? Or am I making that up?
I don't think so. I think that's a fifth edition thing. I believe
that's a fifth edition thing. Okay.
I think fifth edition you can either increase ability or get a feat. In third, you were definitely going to get both.
Right. Well, feats were much more standardized in third, which is why I bring that up, because I feel like in fifth, the choice is feat versus ability scores, less of a choice if you're not using, obviously if you're not using the feat rules. And I feel like that is a bigger debate amongst fifth edition players as to whether or not to use feats at all.
Got it. Yep. Got it. Interesting. Let's go back and forth. So one thing that affected your guess at that, Paul, is you said here in fifth, the very first thing they talk about is the rolling the 46 drop 1. Then there's the standard array. Then there's a point buy. I didn't get an image of it, but interestingly, fourth edition has the exact same 3 methods. So I feel like in earlier editions we'll see a larger array of possibilities, but fourth edition had the exact same 3 methods, except that it gave it in a different order. In fourth edition, the very first thing they talked about was standard array. And then the second thing that they talked about was point buy. And then the very last thing they said was, like, if you're some kind of crazy person, you might want to roll dice, namely 46 drop low, order it how you want. So I think there's been at least, since 2008, there's been at least some impression that standard array might actually be the first thing that people turn to. And fifth edition tried to bring back the original concept of rolling dice as the first thing, but I would guess that probably not. That there's a lot of reasons why people have gotten away from the dice, unfortunately.
Well, I think there's another angle of this discussion that we should have, which I'm going to introduce now, and we can revisit as we go back through editions, which is how important are these ability scores anyway? Right? Like how impactful are they on your character and on how you play your character? And I feel like the answer in 5th edition is that they are hugely important. And am I right in remembering that, like, that I believe by 5th edition the bonuses are a linear progression? That's correct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every 2
Since
or every
third.
3 points.
Yep.
Yeah.
Every 2.
It's up by 1. Right, and it's really the modifiers, right? Like, also I'll bring up that, like, when you look at 5th edition character sheets, that's when we start to see the trend of flipping the importance of the modifier versus the stat. Right, you start to see these character sheets where you have a big box for what is your plus, and then a small box for what is the actual score.
Right.
Agreed. And so that's really interesting, I think.
Yeah. The bonuses have been stable since 3rd edition, right? So 3rd, 4th, 5th edition use the exact same mechanic for what bonuses the abilities give you. And that really, for what it's worth, that actually spawns out of a mechanic in the 1st edition Dungeoneer Survival Guide. Actually, it's Oriental Adventures, actually. They started to bring in skill proficiencies that improved by 2 pips per point in your ability. So that actually, by 3rd edition, that the whole system turned into that, basically.
And can you bring up the most recent comment here by Kevin Thompson? I think that's also an interesting point. There you go.
So Kevin writes, to me, it's a... Go ahead, Paul.
Kevin says, to me, it's a question if you agree to let players pick their class before they roll instead of after, which is fascinating to me because this came up recently in your playthrough of the Gold Box games.
Yep.
Right. So just as a weird counterpoint, Dan's been playing Pool of Radiance from 1983 that game came out.
1988. 1988. I play modern games, Paul. 88.
Modern games.
Late 80s.
Right, and that's an implementation of 1st edition D&D. And one of the interesting things is when it runs you through character generation, it generates the stats. No, it makes you pick the racing class first, and then it generates the stats. And there's a point in there, right, where you can modify the stats. And allegedly, the reason for that is because it wants to allow you to like take your paper characters and translate them into the game. Supposedly, that's the reason for that.
It's not cheating. It's not so everybody can cheat their ass off at it.
No. Yeah, it's not cheating. But the interesting thing for me was always like the main reason for wanting to do that or wanting to like re-roll, because you could also hit a re-roll button, I think, right? You could say like, no, I don't like these stats, re-roll them. Yeah. And the main reason for doing those things is because, well, I just picked to play a fighter and then my stats are like really high int and really low strength. So what the hell?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that was always the logic for me for saying like, okay, I'll hit the reroll button a couple times, because if I was playing this in paper, I would have rolled the stats first, looked at the numbers and went, oh, this character's got a really high strength, therefore I'm going to make them a fighter, rather than the other way around. Right. What do we get in 5th edition, Dan? What comes first? Stats or class?
I'm so glad you asked, because and you're right. This is, you and Kevin are right, that that's actually an enormous, that might, to me, that it's weirdly might possibly the biggest question in my mind about like, what are stat generations? What's the whole point of it? And 5th edition, you pick race and class and then your abilities. 4th edition, same thing. Race and class and then your abilities. 3rd edition is this transition point where, interestingly, in 3rd edition, step 1 is you roll your abilities, then you pick your race and class, and then you assign your abilities. Isn't that interesting? So you actually you generate 6 in 3rd edition. You generate 6 numbers. You haven't assigned them yet. Then you pick your race and class. Then you assign the 6 numbers. Now before that, right? 2nd edition, 1st edition, 0 edition. You definitely assigned your abilities first, and based on that, you pick your race and class. And 3rd edition is this pivot point where they're like, it's kind of both, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and I didn't remember that till I looked that up this morning. But I was like, really? How fascinating is that?
Yeah. And this brings us to this sort of like argument that you and I have had, or interpretation you and I have had about like, you know, do you come to the table with a character in mind and try to create it, versus do you let the game generate a character for you and then you run with it, right? And it does feel like that has shifted over time, right? It does feel like the mechanics of 5th edition, definitely, and the way I hear 5th edition players talk about their characters is, oh, I have this great character idea, I can't wait to go make it, right? Whereas opposed to like old school, more often I get the notion of like, I'm going to sit down at the table, roll some dice, and see what I get.
Exactly. Maybe we should jump to the first slide. Maybe we should jump back to the root of this whole thing, because I think it's going to blow some people's minds what original D&D actually says about ability score generation. So it should be the very first slide.
Is this the explanation of abilities one?
No, it's the other one.
Yeah, unfortunately, my slides
determination.
are jumbled here.
Determination of abilities is what it says at the top.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
there you go.
Great.
Okay. So this is the original D&D Volume 1 text from 1974, and I think that this first sentence is just really fascinating, because it actually says, prior to the character selection by players, it is necessary for the referee to roll 3 6-sided dice in order to rate each as to various abilities, and thus aid them in selecting a role. And then here come your standard abilities, strength, intelligence, and so forth. So in original D&D, what it actually says is the players don't have any part in determining their abilities whatsoever, including even rolling the dice. The referee rolls 3d6 in order, hands it to the player, and the idiom there is that by looking at which one is higher, that'll give you a clue about what choice to pick for your race and class that comes next. Now, weirdly, the one example that you've got on there specifically calls out, here's the abilities, 6 strength, 11 intelligence, 13 wisdom, and the player chose to play a magic user, we'd call a wizard now, and that was a mistake. They should have picked a cleric, dumb player, but that's on them. Right? It's like, that's on them. Player can do that. That was a bad choice. But you can pick a bad class. So how fascinating is that? And I think about this myself. In fact, maybe if we think about playing online, again, this whole question of like, does the DM audit what the player did? I mean, that would solve the online auditing problem if the DM just handed you 6 abilities and said, deal with this, suck it. Right?
That is fascinating. That is fascinating.
Now, let me defend this a little bit. Okay, that might look totally insane, but to me, I think there is a reasonable point of this. Imagine, if you will, that you have never heard about any role-playing game, and in fact, the term role-playing game hasn't even been invented when this book comes out, right? You don't know what D&D is, you have no idea what this whole hobby is like, and you don't know any of the abilities, you don't know any of the 6 abilities, you have no idea what the class options are, and you have no idea what the race options are. This actually does give a completely blank new player an easy way into the game, right? You don't need to learn the 6 abilities because you're not going to choose among them. You don't need to know all the classes because the DM can just say, this would be best for a cleric, but you can play something else if you want to, right? And admittedly, in the 3rd edition era, I have had a game that I tried to run with brand new players, right? And I said, roll your 4d6, order them what you want, and you're going to pick race and class later. And those players got really bogged down because they felt that they had to understand all the different ramifications in the entire game of all the modifiers, of all the 6 abilities, of all the 10 races, of all the 12 classes before they could make those choices. And we wound up not actually playing. So I actually do see a little bit of advantage if you're in this position where D&D has not existed in the world and no one knows anything about it. Bam, here's your abilities. You don't need to learn anything to get started with the game, and this actually informs you what class you should pick.
I mean, why not go the final step then and play it like we often do at conventions, where we just say, here's a stack of character sheets, pick one.
Yep. Because the DM doesn't want to do that work. I prepped for that question. I thought that's an excellent question. I had to think about that myself before. And this is truly low low DM prep of they didn't want to go. But no, I agree. If you do have that option, then actually that actually does. I actually, the truth is, in practice nowadays, I actually agree with that. If I am going to do that, just have a stack of characters and you can pick, or what you do, Paul, is you have the players roll dice for the order that they pick.
Right. Yeah, which gives you a little bit of gambling and also just subverts the whole awkward social encounter of a bunch of people, especially at a convention where there are people who don't really know each other and they're sitting down at the table for the first time, and it's like, who gets to go first? Who gets first pick on a, right? I would really, people come to the table with a lot of different expectations and a lot of different wants. And whether that's, I have a very strong idea of what I want to play versus like, I don't know what I'm doing, somebody help me. By falling back on the dice like that, you just say like, look, there's rules and they're arbitrary and somebody wins and somebody loses and we figure that out via dice. So I like that. I like that a lot. But I like, frankly, anytime I've run an introductory game, whether it's at a convention or just for a group of people who've never gotten to play before, that is generally how I run it, is I pre-make a bunch of characters. And I just bring a table and I say, here are a bunch of characters. It also, frankly, is a great way for me to introduce the idea in old school gaming that life is cheap for these characters, that like there's a good chance you might die, because I set that tone immediately by handing them a stack of character sheets that's maybe twice the number that are actually needed. And I say, this is, well, partly that's to give you a little extra choice, and partly it's so that when your character dies, there's another one for you to play.
I like that moment. I totally agree with that. A number of our viewers were anticipating that, pre-gens would be a good solution to this issue. And, for what it's worth, now we have, software tools that didn't exist, and it's frankly easier to generate a whole bunch of characters and get, sheets printed out. Whereas when, in 1974, when this was first done, you would have had to do every single bit of that by hand.
True. Right. Yeah. I mean, it is important to remember that, like I remember playing D&D in the mid 80s, and like just getting someone to actually photocopy a character sheet was an ordeal, right? Like maybe I would go down to the library. Maybe they would have a Xerox machine, or maybe I, could get my dad to take the character sheet into his office and use the company equipment to make photocopies. But they were precious. I remember taking an old character sheet and erasing everything so I could reuse it.
There's a 3,000-year tradition of that, Paul, of scraping paper in order to reuse the papyrus, right? Maybe someday someone will use an X-ray machine to try to detect what the original character was under that.
Oh my goodness.
But I'm in the exact same thing for me, and my mother was the exact same thing. And at some point, the first edition AD&D character sheets that were on this goldenrod paper, and at some point, my mother found goldenrod colored paper. So I was like, oh my god, that's the most amazing, that's the best gift ever. Fantastic.
Right?
I was so thrilled about the correct
color.
Yeah, right.
Amazing. All right, let me ask you some questions here about original edition here. So I want to go back and review some of the things we talked about with 5th edition. Specifically, let's start with just how important are the stats? How important is it to have a high intelligence magic user in 0 edition, Dan? How bad is this? When this player said, I have a 13 wisdom but an 11 intelligence, I'm going to play a magic user. Going to be the worst magic user in the game?
No, it's not. That's a good question. The other thing that I think people would be surprised about is how much less important, which is what I think you're getting at, how much less important the abilities were in original D&D. And in particular, right out of the book, Volume 1 had 3 classes, right? You had fighter, what we'd call wizard, and cleric. And the first 3 abilities, right, strength, intelligence, wisdom, are what they call prime requisites to support those classes. And they have no in-game effect whatsoever. Strength, intelligence, and wisdom in original D&D had 0 in-game effect. What they did affect, and frankly, I'm not super fond of this mechanic, is they gave a bonus to received experience points. So for those fighter, cleric, wizard characters, when you get experience, you'd get maybe 10% or 20% added XP based on your strength, intelligence, wisdom. Other than that, absolutely no effect in the game.
I've never really understood, honestly. Do you know why? Why is the experience bonus in there? It feels like it was an attempt to correct something. That's the best I can say.
I think that it's a bumbling. I think it's an early, quick attempt. Shouldn't strength be good for fighters? Yes. Shouldn't intelligence be good for wizards? Yes. And it was a frankly ham-handed attempt at addressing that.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not. That's something that when I play original D&D, I strip out. Yeah. I don't think that was a terribly good mechanic. I know that's probably heresy for certain audience members. I'm sorry.
No, what I'll say where the stats did matter, right, is really the physical stats, right? You have strength, dexterity, constitution, directly impacting your to hit armor class and
not in original D&D. Strength had no effect in original D out of the box. No effect. Just experience for fighters. No effect other than that whatsoever. Right.
I get a constitution bonus to my hit points.
You do. So for the 3 abilities that are not tied to classes, dexterity, constitution, charisma, they have a little bit of effect. Dexterity and constitution will add up to 1 point. Dexterity will add 1 point to your hit with missiles, and constitution will add 1 point to your hit points per level if you have a very high score, like I think 15 or above. That's it. The end.
Wild.
And then, of course, charisma actually might be the most important ability because that one actually dictates whether you can get 5 or 12 henchmen following you. So, as we get away from that, of course, charisma became a dump stat, people would say. But technically, out of the book, charisma was the most important one because it determined whether you had 5 or 15 henchmen assisting you. But physically in the fight, the dexterity and constitution gave you either -1 or +1. That's it, the end.
So when this is fascinating here for me because, of course, Dan and I both these days play original edition Delta a lot, right? Which is a set of house rules that Dan has published on top of 0 edition. But the funny thing is that my background is more BX, right? That's really
Yeah.
I'm my and that often I think comes through when we have these discussions, and I realize I have all these blind spots about Zero Edition because I have this assumption of BX as a basis. But I was house ruling BX in a direction that was more similar to the direction Dan was house ruling Zero Edition. We kind of like met in the middle, I feel like. Um, so I'm always curious. So, like, where did my question, I guess, is when did we start seeing things like bonus to hit for high strength? Like, you use that, right, in Zero Edition Delta?
I do. I do.
OED.
And
Yeah.
you're right. I replaced the XP thing, right? So there's got to be something. I agree with that. I replaced the XP thing with that. Makes more sense. Admittedly, 1 year later. Okay, so original D&D came out in 74. 1 year later, in 75, you had the first supplement, the Greyhawk supplement. And yes, then you've got these major tables, and they're identical to what you see in first edition, right? Advanced D&D.
Yeah.
And now you get these expanded tables for strength, and the decimal score for strength, and spell, intelligence, giving you spells for wizards and stuff like that. And it says, right, it does say right in that supplement, fighters need some additional boost to maintain their power versus wizards. So here comes this big table with lots of bonuses for strength. Way more complicated than what you see nowadays in 5th edition. But admittedly, 1 year later, he was moving in that direction, maintained the XP awards. And then with BX that you play with Moldvay, very wisely simplified that to a much simpler bonus scheme, which looks quite a bit, frankly, like the 5th edition scheme.
Right. I would say though. So here's my arguments coming from a BX standpoint. Yeah. And then also I'm going to be confused and misremember when the linear progression came along because of BX. The modifier was a bell curve, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, you start to have things where the abilities directly impact the character type archetype that they're meant to play, right? Like intelligence is affecting how many spells or your chance to learn spells. Strength is affecting your ability to hit things, which fighters want to do. But I would still say the amount by which they affect these things is very low. And that, it's still not that big of a deal. Like, I could still play an 8 intelligence wizard, and it's fine.
Totally. In BX, particularly, there's no effect that intelligence has on your spellcasting capacity whatsoever.
Right. I would argue I could even play, I could play a fighter with strength 6. It's not the best, but I'm not such a ridiculous disadvantage that you're like, why are you playing a fighter with that character class with those stats?
Yep. One interesting thing. Go ahead.
I was going to say part of that argument though is just the style of play and what kind of things you're encountering, because a couple a +2 or +3 difference into hit, it does feel fairly substantial, but I also think the style of play in those games is less about hitting things, right? It's more about maybe avoiding those fights or playing more intelligently to like unearth the treasures and get out of there without exposing yourself to a dangerous fight.
Agreed. It's early D&D is a war. It's not a sport.
Yeah. That's an interesting way to put it.
And now it depends on what die you're rolling, right? If you're rolling a D20 to hit, +1 or +2 isn't that much. But then if you're rolling like a D6 to maybe open a door or for damage, right? That's a much bigger swing. And a lot of people will say bonuses to your damage are a lot more important than bonuses to your 2 hit. And I'm pretty convinced about that, actually. So if you're doing, and again, early D&D had a lot more D6 based stuff, right? As people always get reminded by when they play my games, is you're rolling D6s to open a door, to hear a noise, to avoid a trap, on and on and on like that. And then if there's a bonus to that, it's actually a pretty big swing all of a sudden.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Now, one thing I'll point out is that it's easy even for me to forget about sometimes, is that there was another thing that ability scores impacted in first, second, and zero edition, if you include the supplements. And that was that the classes were locked behind requirements for particular ability scores, right? And that all got wiped out as of third edition, so that hasn't been the case for going on 22 years now. But in zero edition, right, you had the four basic classes: fighter, cleric, wizard, thief. And as we saw in the example that Gygax was making fun of his sample player, as we saw in the example, you could pick any one of those four classes. It didn't matter what your ability scores. And I agree with you, Paul, you could work perfectly proficiently regardless of your ability scores. But as they started to roll out, right, when the supplements came out and they started to roll out these extra variant, what we'd call subclasses of a paladin or a monk or a ranger or a druid or something like that, they always had these requirements of, in order to qualify for this special class, you need to have extra ability scores. For example, paladin, you had to have a charisma of 17. You have to have 17 or 18 charisma to get in the paladin class. And interestingly, there's no attempt for those classes to be balanced against your base classes. They were purely additive, right? So a paladin had everything that a fighter had plus extra stuff on top. So there was this, so the balance mechanism at the time was you need to have extra high ability scores to qualify for these special classes. And in, late zero, first, second, a lot of the interest in having higher ability scores was to qualify for these special classes. And of course, that doesn't exist anymore.
So I have this very distinct memory as a kid. I was playing in D&D campaign that was run actually at camp. So one of the activities is you could play D&D. And I remember the first day that first session of that, the counselors were surprised at just how many kids signed up to do this. Like they were clearly, the counselor was prepared to run a D&D campaign, and we had something like 15, 16 kids show up or something very big. And he was like, nice. This is too many. And so they quickly came up with a plan to I understand. But I think we were either playing first or second edition at this point. And the counselor decided, we're going to split this group up into actually 3 parties, 3 different adventuring parties, and I'm going to DM them on different time. We're going to slice up the time. We're going to DM them on different times. But for now, since you're all here, let's go ahead and make characters, and we can figure out, once we have this big pool of characters, we can figure out how to break you up into parties. So it was a very interesting experience because you basically got 15 kids sitting around making characters and then building teams out of those characters, right? Literally, it was kind of a neat, it was a total accident that it happened that way. Yeah. But in retrospect, I'm like, that's super cool. We should do that more often. Anyway,
it's like a whole meta generation question of I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. And I bring this up specifically now because the other key memory of this event is we're sitting around and kids are rolling dice, and this one kid just comes up with just amazing stats, and immediately everyone's looking over his shoulder and going, "Oh, you can be a paladin," right? And that was it, right? It was like, of the 15 or 16 of us, one person could be a paladin, and everyone was very excited about that. And there was no the poor kid had no choice, right? He was like, you're going to be a paladin, because everyone around you was like, you have to be a paladin. You can do it.
Yep.
And it was very exciting. And it was, and there you go. And there's your kind of statistical, evidence that it's rare and difficult, right? 1 out of 16 kids got a paladin.
Yes, exactly. Isn't that interesting? It's such an interest. What a wonderful memory, actually. But that was my experience. First edition, all the way through first edition, is if you actually rolled a 17 or 18, you were almost committed to, you had to run a paladin at that point, because otherwise no one would ever see one. And it's interesting because I feel like someone could complain about that, but it's interesting because there was a sensibility at the time that, what's happening for player character generation is not purely just power fantasy, but you're in a world. And I think that later on I think I've seen a number of things that, Gygax and company just assumed that there would be equity in the rules between player characters and all the rest of the world. So, with a couple of small exceptions, whatever happened for player characters should basically be what's happening for the rest of the world. And so, with the idea of like what does our world building look like? What is the demographics or profile of our world? That's going to bleed through into the character generation, and you are going to experience the same thing, and vice versa. So I like that it clearly communicated, and it absolutely happened in that situation, that having paladins were super rare, and people got really excited about seeing one. And I haven't seen anything since that communicated that same excitement about a particular player class. No matter how wahoo they've tried to make classes since that moment where you kind of expected not to have that, and then it stumbles out at everybody, was super exciting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Also, paladins had to be lawful good. I don't know if there's any viewers watching that don't know that, right? Of the 9 alliance, paladins had to be lawful and they had to be good. There was no other choice. That was what paladins were about. And of course, that's very different now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Gosh, I feel like there's and we're running low on time. And
God damn it!
Oh, okay. We're running low on time here, and I feel like there's a dozen different things that we haven't talked about, and so I wanted to bring them up quickly and see if there's anyone here that you want to glom onto. But like, we haven't talked about percentile strength. We haven't talked about 46 drop the lowest. When did that show up?
Yeah. We should say that has been there since first edition, right? A common misconception is that first edition D&D had 3d6 in order, and it absolutely did not. That is not said anywhere in any of the books. One thing I will say that's interesting about first edition AD&D is that the player's handbook has no way of generating ability scores. That's locked away among other things, it's locked away in the DM's book as a secret, right? And there's 4 different methods that the DM can opt in their campaign. There they are. Thank you for bringing those up. That's in the DM's guide for first edition.
Right.
Right. None of them are roll 3d6 in order. The first method is the first method in 5th edition. It's roll 4d6 and drop the lowest and sort them to your taste. And that has, largely, that's the first method in 1st edition, and that it largely is what we, are familiar with as the basis for how you make abilities in 1st and 2nd and 3rd, and it's an option in 4th, and that's the first thing out of the box in 5th.
What are your thoughts on this, Dan? Like, why this push? Like, because clearly stats are rated from 3 to 18 based on the generation method, right? Like, that's clearly derivative of the fact that you're rolling 3d6. That's how you get. Like, otherwise, the choice of rating on a scale of 3 to 18 is ridiculous. Why would you pick those numbers? But then there was clearly this push to like tinker with the probability, shift that curve on over to the right, and make player characters generally better than a 3d6 roll would actually produce. Why?
Agreed. Well, let me just, what he does have a little bit of motivation for that. I didn't put it in the slide online, but he says. This is what he says in first edition to motivate that. As AD&D is an ongoing game of fantasy adventuring, it is important to allow participants to generate a viable character of the race and profession which he or she desires. While it would be possible to generate some fairly playable characters by rolling 3d6, there is often an extended period of attempts at finding a suitable one due to quirks of the dice, and et cetera. And then you get these 4 methods here. So part of the motivation there is actually, weirdly, I think, to qualify, right, for those special classes that are locked. And then that actually does culminate 6 years later. There's a method 5. 6 years later, there's a method 5 that comes out in his Unearthed Arcana supplement just moments before he's booted out of the company, in which you get to pick your class first, and then you're guaranteed minimum ability scores for that class.
Interesting. I think you have a slide on method 5. Yeah. I'm just trying to find it.
Right. I do. Yeah.
It's big enough. I haven't. Method 5. Yeah. I'm going to find it, but can you go ahead and just read it out to us?
Yeah, it's I don't have it
Oh,
right
it's
in
quite
front of
long.
me, but the point is, yeah, thank you. There it is.
Mhm.
So, yeah, oh, interesting. This method can only be used to create human player characters. Of course, um, of course. So, and what it says is it gives a player an opportunity to generate a character of a desired class subject to DM's approval. And again,
Yeah.
this is in the DM's only section of this book. But it does allow the player to pick the class first. And then what you see in that table is here's how many dice you're going to roll for the ability take the best three. So, like if you're a paladin on the second row there, you would roll 7 dice, take best three for your strength. You roll 5 dice, take best three for your int. You'd roll 9 dice, take best 3 for your charisma. But if you still get less than 17, you get the 17 that's going to qualify you for paladin. That's the idea. There's an additional column there for comeliness that we are not going to talk about today. Not talking about that.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
So we were going in a direction where clearly Gary was having people that were desirous of the special classes that were locked behind ability scores, and he was going, and at least part of the motivation was clearly to give people more options for their classes, culminating here, where maybe now you can just pick your class to begin with. So more flexibility, but less excitement when it happens. Yeah. That's the yin yang of that design decision.
And I feel like this is really seeing that flux between what you were talking about before about how you want the player generation system to be reflective of the greater world, right? And the statistics in that world. Paladin should be very rare, therefore it should be very difficult to make a paladin. Versus eventually a play group playing together for a while, and I can just totally hear the players going like, "We never get to play with a paladin. You made all these cool rules for paladins, and we never get to use them. What the hell?" I really want to see, or I would really want for once in my life to play a paladin. How can we make that happen? Right? Yeah. And this is totally reasonable. I think it's a very reasonable request, and it's reasonable for the DM to be like, yeah, you're right. You know what? I made all these rules for paladin. I want to see it in play. You want to play a paladin. We should make that possible.
I think there's a tension there. I think there's a real tension there. This is, I mean, frankly, someone who has lived from the 1900s to the 21st century, this is sort of what the slide in our life has been. As things get easier and easier, they're less and less meaningful. Frankly, there's as the productive challenge goes away, there's surprisingly less excitement in this thing that we worked for so long to get to. So I think there's at least a little bit of tension there. I know of, there's, I remember Gary telling a story about this one monster in his Greyhawk campaign that nobody ever beat. Nobody ever beat it. And it had the best treasure that anybody had ever seen. And he had some kind of secret behind the scenes that nobody ever figured out. And, Gary took it to his grave. Nobody figured it out, and nobody ever will, right? And that's why I'm talking about it right now. And that's why, and on the one hand, that's absolutely crazy, but it still gets under my skin that there was this secret that in the Greyhawk campaign that people were confronting for years that literally no one ever figured out, and that is what's burrowed into my head is specifically the thing that they couldn't do. That's amazing. Yeah. There's at least a bit of a give and take. The easier you make those things, I think that there is some amount of eventness to them that gets dialed down at the same time.
Dan, we're in the last 5 minutes. What are your final thoughts on stat generation?
My final thoughts last an hour. I have a whole separate section. I have a whole separate section here. So, you started off, right? You started off saying, you and I like to sit down at a table and we like to roll 3d6 in order, and we like to decide what the character is like. And, I think that there is, it's an interesting question about whether the role playing should be about, because people in the world, existentially, people in the world have constraints, right? And there's one existentialist philosopher who said, "I am my body," right? And we don't get to entirely pick our body, right? And so there's almost a philosophical question about whether role playing is an opportunity to experience existences that we didn't expect and we would not have imagined in advance, versus is it an entertainment that's purely a reflection of our existing desires, right? So if we come at the table and it's just a matter of the ideas that I already had in my head are going to get reflected back, right, by my choice, versus me getting surprised by a role or an existence that I had never thought of before, which is a more interesting stretch. And obviously, we have different expectations for what when we come to a role playing game. But I like the stretch. I like having randomness, and I like being surprised by characters that I never would have visualized before they appeared to me at the table, frankly. And for that, I like, my system, as some people in the chat have said, is a little bit of both. If you're making a first level character in my game, you get to pick one ability to begin with that you roll extra dice for, and the other 5 you got to roll 3d6 in order for. And I like at least some of the randomness so that we get to be surprised.
Yeah, I'm of a similar bent myself, but I have a slightly different rule, which is just I do 3d6 in order, and then I allow one swap. Mm-hmm. You can pick 2 abilities and change their positions. So if you are desperate to have a high strength, you can figure out a way to make that happen. But
totally legitimate. I love it.
Could still roll straight 3s, right? Could still roll straight 3s. Possible.
Yep.
Never seen it. Yep. I mean, I think I would be really excited to. And it's funny too that I think it's funny that that's the one I'm excited for. Straight 18s? Oh, that's boring. Whatever. Straight 3s. That's an interesting character.
And in original D&D, they're not that much, weaker than anybody else. It's, my favorite and longest running character that I ever played started off with 1 hit point.
Yeah.
Technically in first edition, I think. So they're not that, having really low ability scores doesn't make that much difference. And you can, use that to motivate your performance, and maybe you can make them powerful. Now, the chances are frankly stacked against you, but you should try it. You should try taking an all 3s character and seeing what you can do with them.
But conversely, I would say I would do that if you're playing an old edition of D&D. I would say that the modern editions of D&D have shifted in direction enough that that's just not going to be fun, right? The mechanics and the style of play have shifted to the point where stats are important, and playing a character who's at a significant disadvantage from the other characters at the table in a modern version of D&D is making the game less fun for that player. So
agreed. You would need to play, basic or original, basically.
Yeah. So is there one best way to roll stats? I would argue no. There is a way that is best for the edition of the game you're playing.
Agreed. And the type of players you have. At the moment, I'm actually kind of on the fence. I think that the original D&D method of the referee just hands you the abilities actually makes quite a bit of sense for people that D&D just didn't exist in the world, and you don't know abilities or races or classes. As people learn more about the game and they have more awareness and more history with it, then there's an additional reason, based on that awareness, that they would want to pick a particular class that they haven't played before. And I can see additional reasons to be able to tune it for the particular class that you want. So I can see, at least even with the exact same edition, I can imagine 2 different tracks for, if you're a brand new player, consider this, maybe a pre-gen. And if you're an expert player, you get to actually craft your character the way that you want. That could happen in the same game, I could imagine. Now, how you balance the stats of that, that's a prickly problem. But I could see that too.
Viewers, if you have opinions on the best way to generate stats, or a different way, do you have a method 7? Method, is that what we got into? Method 6?
I think there's 6. There might be 6. You know what? Great. There's 6 editions. You roll a d6, pick which method you want randomly. That's a good method.
Great. If you have a different method, please leave a comment for us here in the video. We'd love to hear from you. Curious to hear how other people play it, and see if that spawns additional conversations.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure people have opinions, and I'm interested in hearing what they think too. Should 6th edition do something different? Should they add something, or are we settled on these 3 methods that we see in 4th and 5th edition now? Again, the rolling dice one is the same as since 1st edition. I wonder if they should change anything in 6. But remember, if you're new to our channel,
at what point do we stop using a 3 to 18 scale? When does that become irrelevant? Sorry, toss that one out there for you.
Even 1st edition supplement books have numbers that go past 18. Not the core books, but supplement books. So, okay, now I'm doing a database search on that. It's really dangerous.
Disrupted you. I disrupted you.
That was really dangerous. I love it. So if you're new to the channel, remember that you can like, follow, and subscribe to us. We're the Wandering DMs, and we're on YouTube and Twitch and Twitter and Facebook and GitHub and TikTok. And by God, we have the handle Wandering DMs on all of those sites. So look for us there.
If you prefer to listen to our show in audio-only podcast format, you can get those files at our website at wanderingdms.com. Also through various podcast carriers such as iTunes and Spotify and Stitcher. If you're listening to us right now on one of those third-party sites, please take a moment to rate and review us on that site. That helps other users of that site find us, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, we really do. And of course, huge thanks to the patrons who support the show, both on Patreon and with great suggestions for episodes on our Discord server. If you would like to join them, please visit patreon.com/wanderingdms, and you'll see our different tiers, access discounts on merch, access to our Discord server, and you can be included in our after-party chat that we hold every Sunday. We'll be there in about 10 minutes to continue the discussion live and get more of your ideas about options for ability score generation that we haven't tried or haven't thought about ourselves. And Paul, are you going to run out to the lake right now?
Yeah.
Is that what's happening?
Quite possibly. I will, if possible, I will poke into the after-party chat today. But I am wandering. Actually, I will be traveling, so it might be difficult. So internet gods willing, maybe I'll see you there. But if not, you're gonna have to carry the conversation without. Yeah.
Cool. I'll be interested to see what the method of travel is. Are we gonna in the after party chat? Are we gonna see Paul in a boat? Are we gonna see Paul in a plane? Are we gonna see him in a car or a train? Hey, that even rhymed. So that's don't forget about our other shows, right? This fall we have other shows planned. I guess I can't talk about those yet, but in a couple of weeks we'll probably have a number of other shows. At the moment, I will invite people to join me late night Thursdays for my playthrough Pool of Radiance, which we're having a lot of fun with, and I'm getting a lot of help because I haven't played it before, so everything's a surprise and everything's new to me. So check that out on Thursday, and then we will be back next week for another show. I think we know. I think we have an idea what we're going to talk about next week.
Maybe.
I just surprised Paul. Anyway, so we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Everything's a surprise all the time. So we'll figure it out. Don't forget, we are, of course, live every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So we hope that you'll join us again next week for another thought-provoking discussion.
We'll see you then. Bye, everyone.